Hi, I'm Sylvia Schaefer. I'm a pattern designer, and I want to talk to you today about gradient quilts and how to match the binding on gradient quilts. This is an example of a gradient quilt where the background changes from the top to the bottom of the quilt. And you can imagine that a single color binding might not look very good on this quilt because it would be jarring at either the top or the bottom. So what I like to do on quilts like this is match my binding to my piecing. You can see that the binding changes color from top to bottom. I want to show you how to do this on a little mini quilt that I have pieced and quilted. You can see that on this side here, we have straight piecing, and on this side we have angled piecing. And I'd like to show you how to match your binding to both of these kinds of piecing. The first thing that you need to do when preparing to make binding for a quilt like this is to measure your area. It's easy to think that the length of this is going to be the same as it was when you finished piecing it, but you have to remember that when you quilt, particularly if you quilt densely like I did here, it's going to shrink your quilt down a little. So the first thing to do is measure exactly how long the area is. So this is 3 7/8 of an inch rather than 4 inches, which is what it was when it was pieced. So in order to match my binding most precisely, I need to add a 1/2 inch seam allowance to 3 7/8 inch. So that means that I want to cut my piece to 4 3/8 of an inch. So that's what I've done here. And then when I piece it together with my other two colors, that's what it looks like. I've pressed my seams open, I've pressed it in half, and that side is ready to be attached. The strips are 2 inches wide here. That's what I like. You can do wider if you like. On the other side, we have to cut at an angle. Again, it's important to measure and make sure that you're cutting to the right length. Again, it's 3 7/8 on this side. Now, to cut at an angle, I've already cut this strip at an angle, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to measure and mark 4 1/2 inches. Now, the reason I'm marking 4 1/2 inches is because when you're cutting and piecing at an angle, you actually want to add 5/8 of an inch of seam allowance. I know that sounds strange, but it has to do with the geometry of angled seams. So I'm going to mark 4 1/2 inches here. And then I'm just going to use the 45-degree line on my ruler to cut my strip. Now, if you're working with print, it's important to make sure that these angles are the same direction. So you don't want to cut it like this. You want to make sure that that angle matches the piecing. Okay, so now I can piece those sections as well with my 1/4 inch seam, and that's what I've done here. You might notice that I've got 2 binding strips here. Now, normally we try to only do 1 binding strip, but when we're trying to match the binding to the piecing, it's a really good idea to do it in multiple strips just so you can be particularly accurate about matching things up. Now, on this side, it's going to be really easy. We can just place the binding strip with the right sides together and lining up the raw edges here. And then what I like to use are these little clips to just hold it in place and make sure it's not going to shift. On this side, it's a little more challenging. And what you want to do is you want to mark your 1/4 inch seam allowance on both the binding and the piecing. So I've marked those there, and then what I can do is I can take a pin and just insert it right up on the binding through that intersection that I've marked, like that. And I'll do that on the other color change as well. And then I'm going to place that pin straight down through my quilt sandwich. And I'm just placing it straight down through those marked intersections. Right sides are together. And then I use these clips to hold it in place. And I really like using these clips because if I were to use a pin, I might shift my quilt sandwich. But with these clips, it just holds it perfectly in place. So now I can remove my pins, and I can go ahead and come over to the sewing machine and sew these binding pieces on. I have got a walking foot with a little guide. I'm going to just backstitch a little bit to make sure I hold that in place. And then I'm going to just sew down with a 1/4 inch seam. And I'm just using a sort of standard 2.5 millimeter stitch length. And when I get to the corner, I'm going to stop about a 1/4 inch from the corner, and I'm going to backstitch. And I'm going to cut my threads here. And then I'm going to miter my binding, just like every other binding that you've done. So we're just going to fold up at an angle of 45 degrees and fold straight back down. And I'm going to come back under here and start my next side. I'm going to backstitch again and then just sew down this side. This side is very easy because it's just one color, and so we don't need to worry about anything matching up here. And I'm coming to my second corner. Again, I'm stopping a 1/4 inch in and backstitching. And now I'm going to miter my last corner here. Now I'm on the side where the next binding piece starts, so all I really want to do is just stitch a 1/2 inch or so to make sure I hold that mitered corner in place. So I'm just going to backstitch and stitch about 1 inch, tie off my threads here, and now I've attached my first side. I'm going to do the exact same thing on the second side. And I have already done this on this piece over here. So you can see that now there are 2 ends here. And those I'm just going to join like any other binding ends that you might have to join. You can do this in whatever way is most convenient for you. What I like to do is just trim off one of the ends of the binding. And then I take a marking pencil, I place that on top of my second end of the binding, and I'm just going to mark where those 2 binding ends meet. And then I'm going to make my final join by placing the ends together like this at a right angle. And at this point, I can place some pins to just hold that in place. I can also go ahead and mark the seam line that I'm going to stitch on using my ruler. You want to make sure that you always draw your line on your binding parallel to your quilt. You never want to draw in towards your quilt. So this is the correct line right here. I know everyone's done it. I do it all the time. And so I just wanted to show you that. So this is the line you're going to stitch on right here. And then by doing that, you're going to have these nice joins. So this little finished one here is where we have the joins. You can see those finished joins, and at that point you'll be ready to just fold your binding over to the back and hand stitch it down. And here's the finished quilt after hand stitching. You can see that we have these fabulous matched bindings that line up perfectly with the piecing, and they don't distract from the color changes at all. So the quilt behind me is another example of that. The color of the blues change from top to bottom, and you can see that I pieced those with straight seams, and it just provides a little bit of a frame to those orange blocks. So that's how you match your binding to your piecing. I hope you'll try this on your next quilt because it's a great way to make your finish a little more special.